Welcome everybody. Today's chapter is called The Mighty Works of Jesus. Do apologise if these chapters are a little bit longer than the ones in the Old Testament. There's obviously a little bit more to write about, I guess. The picturesquely phrased mighty works, which the Gospel writers attribute to Jesus, are more commonly known today as miracles. This is a word which to many people suggests some kind of magic. Indeed, some of the Gospel stories told about Jesus look on the surface very much like that. When we're asked to believe that someone changed water into wine, walked across the surface of a lake, fed a large crowd with a negligible amount of provisions, transferred evil spirits from a madman into a herd of swine, calmed a storm with a word of command and brought dead people back to life, our first reaction might well be to dismiss these stories as sheer legends. There was a time when people believed that actions of this kind proved beyond dispute that Jesus was the Son of God. Few of us today would be happy about this attitude. We should point to the fact that stories of a similar kind told in the Old Testament about Moses or Elisha, or in the Middle Ages about St. Francis and other saints, or indeed about holy men in non-Christian religions, would now be regarded as nothing more than pious inventions. What we believe about Jesus cannot rest on such dubious evidence as a few incidents which seem to be little different in character from similar tales which are told about other historical personalities, for whom no claim has ever been made that they were in any sense divine. If, however, on other grounds we reach the conclusion that Jesus does not come into the same category as Moses or Elisha or St. Francis, we should have to look again at these stories of some of his mighty works and ask whether we are entitled to dismiss them simply as legends. First of all, let us see these problem stories in their proper perspective. They form only a tiny part of what the Gospel writers call Jesus' mighty works. What the evangelists are referring to are principally acts of healing. According to the record, the ministry of Jesus had two sides to it: preaching or teaching, and healing. We're given detailed descriptions of certain typical examples of cures which Jesus effected in cases of blindness, paralysis, mental illness and the like. But these are claimed to be simply instances of innumerable other acts of healing which he performed in the course of his ministry. These are his main mighty works. Secondly, the Gospels were written by men who were convinced that Jesus was a unique figure in history. As we've seen, his closest followers had reached the conclusion, based on their own experience, that he was the long-awaited Messiah. By the time the Gospels were written, however, everything that had happened during his ministry was viewed in the light of what was believed to be the greatest miracle of all time, his resurrection. We shall later on look at the question of whether this belief was well-founded or not. But obviously to men who believed that Jesus himself had been raised from the dead, and that far from being merely the Jews' Messiah, he was in fact the Son of God, who had come among men for the salvation of the world, such stories as were mentioned at the beginning of this chapter would not seem in any way out of character. Indeed, the surprising thing is that the Gospels are not studded with the kind of stories of Jesus' supernatural powers, which we find in the apocryphal Gospels of the 2nd century. This brings us to the third point, which is that right from the beginning, our four Gospels as we have them in the New Testament were accepted as authoritative because they were reckoned to have been written by men who knew the true facts of the life of Jesus, either because they'd been with him during his ministry or because they were in close touch with others who had been his companions. They'd been written within a few decades of the crucifixion, when memories were still fresh and when there was still plenty of people who had been on the spot. When memories were still fresh and when there were still plenty of people around who had heard it at first hand from people who had been on the spot. The record of what had happened in the few momentous years of Jesus' preaching and healing mission. Later Gospels, which appeared in the 2nd century and contain a wealth of pious legends, were dismissed as spurious or apocryphal and were never accepted by the Church as true. It's in the light of all this that we should look at the record of the mighty works of Jesus. If the evidence for the resurrection is sound, we ought not to ask whether Jesus could do any of the things mentioned at the beginning of this chapter. The answer is obviously that if Jesus was what the early Christians claimed he was, and what the Church has affirmed about him right down the centuries, we should expect him to do things that no other man has ever done, and to say things such as no other man has ever said. If indeed God became man in Jesus, and for a space lived our common life, we should be surprised if on occasion the latent power of God did not break through and enable Jesus to act in accordance with higher laws than the normal laws of nature that we know about. This doesn't mean, however, that we must necessarily accept every mighty work of Jesus as having taken place exactly as it was recorded in the Gospels. The evangelists were all concerned to draw out the significance of the events in the life of Jesus. And it's often difficult to say how much is fact and how much is interpretation. We must also allow for occasional misunderstandings, pious embellishments, and the fallibility of human memories. Jesus consistently refused to perform spectacular displays of his power to startle people into belief. And in some of his miracles, which we find it hard to account for, in the light of his attitude, we can detect a theological purpose behind the story, which explains much of this difficulty. The story of Jesus changing water into wine, involving the creation of 120 gallons of wine at a wedding party, where the guests had already had enough to drink, is much more likely to be a parable of the replacement of the thin water of Judaism with the rich wine of the gospel. The feeding of a vast crowd with a few loaves and fishes, when they could without great difficulty have gone home for a meal, makes sense if we think of it as a sacramental occasion, an open-air Lord's Supper. The notorious Gadarene swine probably stampeded into the Lake of Galilee, terrified by the clamour of the madman whom Jesus healed. The stories of Jesus walking on the storm-tossed water of the lake and stilling the storm with a word may be meant to illustrate the same power of the Messiah over the winds and the waves as had been claimed for God in the Old Testament times. We can only surmise that these may have been the reasons why such stories are recorded about Jesus at all. When we're told in the Gospel that Jesus had put a curse on a fruitless fig tree, which immediately withered, and when we find in another Gospel a similar story about a fruitless fig tree told as a parable about Israel's unfruitfulness as the people of God, we may well suspect that something Jesus said has mistakenly been turned into something Jesus did. The apparently miraculous great haul of fish, which Jesus made possible for some of his disciples who'd fished in the lake all night in vain, may be intended to be an object lesson of the power of Christ to make his followers fishers of men. And another story where Peter is told by Jesus to go down to the lake and cast his line, with the promise that the first fish he hooks will have a coin in its mouth to pay the tax collector, was probably said as a joke. There's no record that the coin was found. It has been worth looking at these few gospel stories in some detail, because they do tend to overshadow in people's minds the far greater number of Jesus' mighty works which were concerned with the relief of suffering. If we are to believe the gospel record at all, they were as important a part of Jesus' ministry as his teaching. We must not be put off by the fact that in the time of Jesus, all illnesses of the body or of the mind were attributed to demon possession. People who have lived among primitive tribal communities know that the fear of evil spirits is still very real in some parts of the world today. A sick man can be cured if he believes that the demon has been exorcised or driven out by magic potions. And conversely, a healthy man can sicken and die if he thinks that a spell has been put upon him and that evil spirits are working for his destruction. Modern medical science, however, would not accept that blindness, deafness, and epilepsy are caused by demons. Although to the layman, a homicidal maniac comes pretty close to being possessed by the devil. In Jesus' day, all the ills that flesh is heir to, whether it was a disease of body or a disease of the mind, and including death itself, as well as natural disasters such as earthquakes, famines, and storms at sea, were laid at the door of Satan, the prince of darkness, and his myrmidons of demons. God reigned in heaven, Satan ruled on earth. There was constant conflict between God and his angels, who, as his messengers from heaven, were responsible for all the good things that happened in the world, and Satan and his ungodly host, who were bent on making man's existence a veritable hell on earth. The only hope for poor afflicted mortals was, in Jewish eyes, the coming of the Messiah. When Messiah came, they believed, the power of Satan would crumble. The evil spirits at his command would be defeated by the stronger power of God's agent. Satan and his minions would be sent to everlasting punishment. According to Jesus, this had now begun to happen. With the coming of the new age, the rule of God on earth, Satan was being forced to loosen his grip on the lives of men by the stronger power of God, working through his Messiah. By healing men's minds and bodies, Jesus was showing that God was now acting in a decisive way to bring to an end the tyranny of evil. Disease and death and the demons who caused them were being vanquished. The will of God was being done on earth as it already was done in heaven. This explains Jesus' attitudes towards his healing ministry. He's fighting to free men's bodies as well as their minds from the baleful rule of Satan, so that they may live their lives to the full under the beneficent rule of God. By casting out devils from the insane and the epileptic, he's not only restoring them to health, he's demonstrating that this is God's world and not the devil's. What is abundantly clear from the record is that the cures Jesus effected were real cures. If he had lived at a time when demon possession was not the current explanation of disease, the result would have been just the same. Blind men had their sight restored. Lame men walked again. Deranged minds were made whole. So far as we can make out from the Gospels, Jesus had no stereotype technique for effecting his cures. Sometimes it was by exorcism, sometimes it was by laying hands on the patient, or by a touch. Sometimes it involved merely a healing word. Sometimes it seems to have been enough if the friends or relatives of the patient had faith that Jesus could heal. In all cases, however, it's clear that it was an encounter with Jesus which enabled his healing power to operate. There is therefore no parallel with modern medical healing techniques involving diagnosis, prescription of remedies, and a period of convalescence. What impressed the people of his time was the instantaneous effect of Jesus upon human suffering. Nothing could be further from the truth than to think of Jesus' healing ministry as some kind of automatic release of healing power. It was for him a demanding and exhausting business. The ingredients are always, on the part of the patients or their friends, faith that Jesus can make them whole, and on his part, compassion for the plight of men and women who are being prevented by physical ailments from living the full life that is meant to be lived by sons and daughters of God. This doesn't imply by any means that only the physique of an Olympic Games competitor enables a man or a woman to establish the right relationship with God or his neighbour. It does mean, however, that every effort on our part, following the example of Jesus, to reduce the sum of human pain and disability is in accordance with the will of God for his human family. On this whole question of the miraculous element in the life of Jesus, we're perhaps less arrogant than our Victorian forefathers in the first flush of scientific dogmatism, when it was believed that nature was a closed system and that we knew all that there was to be known about the laws which govern the universe. We're more prepared now to recognise that the universe is much more mysterious than we thought it was. So many things have happened in our time that a century ago would have been thought miraculous. In medical science, as much as in the fields of nuclear physics, electronics, and the exploration of outer space. We're more conscious through psychosomatic medicine of the interaction between mind and body, and therefore perhaps more ready to believe that miraculous cures at such centres of prayer as Lourdes do indeed happen, and that divine healing channeled through a praying group can bring about a recovery. The impression we get from the Gospels is that the compassionate power of God flowed through Jesus in boundless measure, because no one before or since his day has even been so much at one with God, or felt himself to be in such an intimate relationship with God. It is in the light of this that we can perhaps begin to understand his mighty works, even on those rare occasions when he turned death into life. We may note that in all three cases recorded in the Gospels, the circumstances were peculiarly poignant. The deaths of a small child, a widow's only son, and a dearly loved personal friend. Of course, all three whom Jesus restored to life would die again in the normal way when their time came. These few cases, where Jesus exercised a power he seldom used, would suggest not only that there were no limits to his compassionate concern for others, but they would also point forward to the truth which Jesus' resurrection demonstrated, that through him death is merely a sleep and an awakening.